And what we called evil not even 10 years ago seems almost caprice compared to what is now done every day. Robert Jordan, The Great Hunt. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski, and that quote I just read was from the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, and that's a series that has amazing world building. But what's unique about its world building is that it doesn't rely on a ton of non-human races and geography and magic or magical creatures to diversify the world, like most fantasy worlds. It uses living beings, and they don't vary that much in like their physiology, but what they have is a massive variety of cultures, and it ties in directly into the overarching plot because it has a lot to do with the clash of cultures, and that's when the world building ties in directly with the plot of a book. So I always thought that was a really good example of excellent, unique world building. Today I'm talking to someone who's thought a lot about world building, and today we'll get to learn about her world. J.M. Frey is an award-winning author, voice actor, and lapsed academic. She also provides writing workshops and talks, like her upcoming appearance at the 2025 Toronto Indie Author Conference. There she's going to have a talk called World Building Through Culture. How fitting. JM, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Jacob.
This is awesome. So I'm going to do my best to make it out to that talk. It's happening in late April.
Yes.
But I only scratched the surface of what you do. It's quite a lot. So you've studied and are very involved in fandom culture.
Yes.
You've had a lot of voice acting roles. You've published a bunch of books, fiction and nonfiction. Your master's thesis was apparently about Mary Sue stories and fan fiction.
Yes.
So it's hard to decide where to start, but I want to start with what first brought your work to my attention. And that's your interest in world building. And I'm wondering, where did that interest come from?
Oh, good question. No one's asked me that before. So I'm going to hold it up for the camera for those of you who can see the video. I've got a copy of my textbook here, World Building Through Culture, which is what the workshop I'm going to be giving is based on, but also the textbook itself is actually an expanded version of the workshop I used to do before the lockdown. And I kind of fell into being this sort of de facto expert on world building at conventions and things because I really enjoy the world building part of writing science fiction and fantasy. And I guess my master's degree was sort of a social anthropology degree. So thinking about all of the stuff that I had learned in school and applying it to cultures, being a sociologist while I'm building cultures helped me be very thorough about it. So when people said, you seem to really think a lot about your worlds, you think about the culture of the world and how that would affect the characters and their motivations and their desires and their fears.
Well, you would hope so.
Yeah.
You would hope that the author thought of it.
Well, and I'm not saying that other authors don't. I'm just saying that world building can be very, very deep or it can be very, very shallow. The Robert Jordan is obviously very, very deep. The Tolkien is very, very deep. And because people kept asking me questions at conventions and autograph signings and stuff, I eventually put this workshop together. And it was significantly shorter at the time. I mean, the textbook itself is well over 400 pages.
Wow.
And it's a workbook. So, those 300 of those 400 pages are lined papers with questions on them where you're supposed to write your answer in. It started with just, like 20 slides on a PowerPoint and grew and grew and grew the more I thought about it and the more I read about sociology myself. And I read about things like hegemony and cultural bias and the cultural iceberg. And I added it to the workshop. And then somehow it became a textbook.
Well, so you've literally wrote the textbook on world building.
I wouldn't say the textbook. It is a textbook on
a
world.
textbook.
But the important thing for me was that I wanted it to be a physical version of the workshop I give. So if you can't fly to Toronto and see me give this workshop next week, or next week? Wait, let me look at the calendar. 2 weeks from now. Then you can just buy the book and get all the exact same information. And the book asks questions, and it asks you to answer them in the same way that I hope people in the audience at the workshop will ask a question and I can answer it, or I can open it to the floor and let anybody else attending the workshop try to answer it. That's sort of how I became interested in it. And the more people asked me to talk about it, the more research I did and the more of an expert I became. But I definitely wouldn't say it's the book on world building.
Well, you don't get to become an expert on something without enjoying it. At least I
love it.
So, and there's a lot of people who don't like science fiction and fantasy. What's the appeal of reading a fictional book that takes place in a completely different world from ours? Like, what is it that brings fantasy and sci-fi readers to new worlds? Because it's not obvious to a lot of people.
I think some of it is the escapism. It's like, okay, I can't stand the politics of this world, so I'm going to go spend time in a world where the politics seem obvious. And the bad guys are obviously bad guys, and the good guys are obviously good guys, and I know who to root for. And the morality isn't gray, it's black or white. It's quite nice to be handed all the answers. I mean, deep down, we're all 3-year-olds going, why? And the nice thing about Star Wars and the Hunger Games and Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time is that it's obvious who the bad guys are. Even in complicated things like Game of Thrones, people that we used to root for, now we hate. It's still the way that it's written and the way that it's shot and the way that it's edited tells us who we're supposed to root for and who we're supposed to fear and who we're supposed to hate. And that's a bit of a relief when you look at the news today and you're not certain who you're supposed to be rooting for and what the politics are. And the other nice thing about world building is that I think a lot of people who really, really love science fiction and fantasy love it for is the cause and effect of it. If we change one small thing, how does that change the entire world? And that's my favorite thing about writing world building as well, is if the world that we live on right now lost electricity tomorrow, how would the rest of society change because of that? How would it change how we eat? How would it change how we farm? How would it change tariffs and alcohol production and consumption? And how, just one small thing, electricity ceased to work. It just stopped working. What would change in our world? And then what would that change in society? How would people share stories? How would people meet one another? How would you get married? How would you have children? How would you vote? Would democracy, as we understand it, still exist? That's, I think, something that people really love about science fiction and fantasy. If I changed this one thing, if the Force existed, if we had the ability to travel faster than light in a spaceship, if there was an entire other species of humanoid creatures that we could intermarry with on the planet, what would that do to our society, to their society? How would we view others in the human race when we have a greater common other? I think that's some of the fascination with it. That's what it is for me anyway. I can't speak for everybody. And mostly people like cool swords. You know, dragons.
The bigger the swords, the better. Yes.
I mean, I wouldn't mind a phaser when somebody walks onto the subway without their earbuds in and they're just listening to crappy music out loud on their phone. I would really love something with a stun setting.
It seems to me like world building involves a lot of questions. How does this work? How does that work? What would the repercussion of X happening? When does it end?
Never.
And I asked that because it never ends.
No. And there's a finite number of pages in my workbook, but I think one of the things I love, you mentioned that I love fandom and I love fan fiction and things like that. I think one of the things I love about it is people taking all the world building done on a television show or in a movie or in a book or a stage musical, and then saying, let me take it one step further. The creator has to stop at some point. The creator, they're going to claw, the publisher has to get that book from me. They're going to claw it out of my hands in time for it to get published. I have to stop working on it. But the reader doesn't have to ever stop working on it. The reader doesn't ever have to stop imagining it. And they can come up with new and interesting and different ways to look at the world building that I've done and say, well, if that's true in this world, if X, then Y, let me extrapolate that further. Let me see what else I can do with that. Like, I mean, I love the Lord of the Rings fan fiction culture that's happening on Tumblr. And there's something called the Reshirement AU, where Thorin lives and retires to the Shire, Reshirement. So I love these stories about someone who has grown up his entire life as a king with the burden of the crown and protecting people, suddenly moving to a place where nobody cares that he's a king. There are no kings in Hobbit culture. But he's the husband of one of the most prominent families. So how does he go from being the most important to the person in the room to being the arm candy for the most important person in the room? How does he deal with farming and being outside? Does he have agoraphobia? He's a dwarf. He's lived his entire life underground. How do you deal with a mental panic attack in the middle of a market in Bree because he can see the sky? I love these kinds of extrapolations and these sorts of stories.
In fan fiction, like the one you just described, it's a fan asking those questions of the world instead of the author. It's like the author passed on that duty to the reader, but it's not really a duty because it's fun.
Yeah.
Right? We wouldn't do it unless it was fun.
Passed on that game, that puzzle.
What is bad world building in your opinion?
Oh, lazy and shallow, I would think. It's I mean, for example, George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones has a lot of really wonderful world building in it, but there's a lot of sexual assault. There's a lot of cruelty to women and women presenting people. There's a lot of cruelty to people with disabilities, especially when the audience is invited to laugh at Tyrion, not with. And I think that's very lazy, because when someone says, why, this is an entirely different world. This is an entirely different world. If dragons exist here, that the author chose to make dragons exist here, and ice zombies and whatever else he put in, why did he choose to put sexual assault and cruelty in this world? Because that's a choice. That's a choice that the author made. Why did he choose to do that? And most people say, oh, because it was like that back then. Back when? Back when we had dragons?
But what do you mean back then?
It's an alternate reality. If you're choosing to build, and that's something that people don't really understand. As an author, every choice you're making is a choice you're making. Now, not every author understands that it's a choice. A lot of people, they're like, oh, I'm just writing down what the crazy people in my head do. And that's fine. But you're writing from a point of cultural bias. So you yourself, as a human being, have grown up in the hegemony of a specific society with specific values and specific dominant religions and specific dominant cuisines. And you are regurgitating that onto the page without realizing that you're working within the confines of the nurture part of nature and nurture. So when you're world building and you don't investigate your own biases and you put sexual assault in a fantasy world, then I think that's lazy world building. There are other ways to move the plot along besides torturing women and doing horrible things to people with dwarfism or who are blind. You know, like, I think that's very shallow world building. But having said that, I think a lot of fantasy and science fiction writers have never been told that they exist within a cultural bias. I don't think they understand that they do. I didn't understand that I existed within a cultural bias until I took a class on cultural bias.
There's been a bit of a movement in fantasy. Not that I've seen people lay it out, but it's just something I've observed is that, especially in the marketing of new series, that they'll say that the series is more inspired by like other cultures. It's inspired by Eastern European folklore, like in The Witcher. And it's inspired by like Japanese or Chinese folklore, and like places from across the world, not just Western Europe and England, right?
Yeah.
Because that's where most of the inspiration comes in fantasy. All the Tolkien-esque books, they're extremely rooted in that Western European culture.
Yes, but modern Western fantasy novels are recreating Tolkien, and Tolkien was specifically trying to create a mythology for Anglo-Saxon England because he grew up in a cultural, and you know, he's a professor and he's studied languages and he's studied myth and history, and all of these great European cultures had Eddas and myth cycles and story cycles, and England had King Arthur, but King Arthur is actually really Welsh. And then there was Scotland had some stuff and Ireland had some stuff, but because the British Isles had been invaded and occupied so much, there was sort of this disjointed mythological history. And that's what he was kind of trying to provide with Lord of the Rings, with the Silmarillion more than Lord of the Rings. But he was trying to create a shared mythology that he felt his culture had a gap in. So that's why you see all this sort of Eurocentric, you know, like the dwarves were, well, they're Scottish in the movies, but they're German in the books, and the elves are French. And someone's going to come at me in the comments because I'm being very reductionist, but you know, the hobbits are English, that kind of stuff. He's trying to build something like that. And then because he was the first really big, successful fantasy author in the 20th century, every fantasy author after that was kind of doing the same thing. And then now in the 21st century, we were like, well, why does everything have to be white, male, Eurocentric? Let's try to find fantasy worlds inspired by other existing cultures. And I think that's wonderful. Right. So long as the person who is writing that is from that culture or has a sensitivity reader from that culture, because then you get into the problem of exotifying other cultures. And it's not a fantasy book inspired by Japanese culture. It's a fantasy book written by a white person from their perspective, what they think Japanese culture is. And it could therefore end up being quite offensive without meaning to be. So in that case, if you're a white person who wants to write about another culture, or not just a white person, but a person from another culture, not from the culture they want to write about, then you get a sensitivity reader. I hire sensitivity readers all the time. For the smallest things, even if something's just one chapter, I will hire a sensitivity reader for it, because I don't want to accidentally perpetuate a negative stereotype in my pursuit of writing an interesting and air quotes exotic world.
I'm thinking of some of the different cultures in some of the books that I've read, and they're not meant to be like a one-to-one representation of a culture on Earth. And sometimes it's kind of like a mishmash of cultures. Like, for example, the Aiel in The Wheel of Time are meant to be like partly inspired by Native American cultures, as well as like having like Shinto, Buddhist, like religious inspirations. And it's, sorry, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say, I think that's wonderful. Having the shorthand of the visual or the religion, having the shorthand of familiar signs and symbols. There's nothing wrong with that. I think mashing things together is part of the fun.
People have been mashing things up in fantasy all the time, like all the way down to like in myths, like minotaurs and centaurs and stuff like that. Yeah. It's like the easiest form of creativity. Just mash two things together and see what happens. But you do the same thing with cultures.
We do that with gummy bears.
Just make a giant ball of gummy bears. That's world building. It's just a giant ball of gummy bears.
It's true. You're not incorrect.
Everybody's just different. But I want to talk about one of the other books that you've, I think it's coming out soon, Time and Tide. Can you tell us about it?
Oh, it actually just came out.
So
this is one of the ones where the world building was a lot easier for me because it's Regency England. Well, it's pre-Georgian England, actually. It's a couple of years before, or it's Georgian England. It's pre-Regency. But it was one of the hardest things for me to research because Regency England is such a popular time period to set historical things like Bridgerton, and Jane Austen's not historical. Jane Austen's contemporary. Her contemporary happened to be 1811 because that's when she was living and that's when she was writing. But there's so much sorry, I'm having problems with that word, mythologizing and making things up. And, you do put dramatic twists on things to make it better for TV or make it better for the book. So there's a lot of nonsense that has been filtered into true history. And there was a lot that I had to be like, is it true that XYZ happened in the Regency era? Or is it just a trope that's been perpetuated so much that it feels like it's true? Where did that actually come from? Is that a fact from history? Or is that something that somebody made up once 30 years ago and every writer has used it since? So it feels true.
And that's an issue that we see in historical fiction as well as fantasy, where because these places are set in what's, at least it's like portrayed to be like a couple hundred years in the past, like in fantasy or in historical fiction, it's more specific. But things like they do things in a specific way in those books that readers can kind of take as like a portrait of history, even though it's completely fictional. And there's something kind of ironic about that.
Yeah, or the way that writers speak with such authority, like fiction writers speak with such authority about something because there's nobody there to counteract it. I was reading an excellently done YA retelling of Pride and Prejudice. But at one point somebody walked into a ballroom wearing his Hussians and I was like, I'm sorry, what? No. No gentleman of Baton would wear his riding boots on the dance floor. Absolutely not. But then because I'm a costume nerd who went to acting school and who just wrote a book set in the Regency era, I know about the dancing pumps that men would wear and the fact that they would literally dance them to shreds. They were so flimsy. But if you didn't know what I know, then if you were going to write a book, you might say, oh, well, he wore his Hessian boots on the dance floor because you read it in another book and you assume that because another author said it, it must be true.
And it must be true in real life. Like that's a historical fact now in that reader's head.
Yeah.
And so
that men wore knee-high riding boots covered in horse crap.
In a beautiful, polished ballroom. I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the reason I want to bring up Time and Tide is because this is the first time you're getting an audiobook done for it. This is an audiobook, and I'm very curious about that process from the author's perspective. What has it been like getting to hear auditions and getting to choose? If you do get the choice, like tell me about it.
Some writers do, some writers don't. For those listeners who don't know, I actually used to work for AMI as a host on one of the segments of the morning show, and I was in radio because I'm a professionally trained voice actor. And I am as involved with this audiobook as I am because they came to me and said, would you like to audition to perform the book. And I thought about it very hard, and I said no, because first off, my British accents are crap. And second, I knew that instead of enjoying the process, I would just be criticizing myself and coming down on myself. And when I finally got the finished version of it, I would only hear my mistakes instead of the joy of my story finally being in an audiobook. So I said, no, I'd like you to pick somebody, but please, can you involve me in the auditions? Because I know this industry very, very well, and I'm going to be picky. And they said, absolutely. So I was involved in the audition process, although I don't actually know who they chose. The production house is not connected with my publisher. Some publishing houses have their own audiobook production house. Some publishing houses do not. So they contract with an outside production company. So I put my choices in, but I don't know if they chose who I liked. And I won't know if they chose who I liked until I hear the final audio, or somebody sends me an email saying, how do I pronounce this word?
So let me get this straight. You wrote the book, and your publisher, obviously they're in contact with you, but they've outsourced the production of Time and Tide. And so there's like 2 levels of distance between you and the production of the audiobook.
Yes. Now, if I had agreed to audition for it and they had chosen me, then I would be directly involved, but I would only be involved as an actor, not as the author.
It's just another example of you handing over the book to other people to add their part of interpretation to it. It's the same thing that readers do.
Yeah. But I trust other professionals to do their job. And that's part of being an author, is you have to trust when you're done with a story that the people you hand it to are going to be good at their job, because otherwise they wouldn't be where they are.
It's going to be so cool for you to hear that final product.
I can't wait.
If they picked a good voice, that is. I'm sure they did.
Jess, all the auditions I heard were great. So it's whichever they picked, it is going to be a good one.
They can't fail. Jess, thank you so much. This was awesome. I'm looking forward to seeing you at the end of the month.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me on. And I promise, as soon as I have a copy of the audiobook, I'm going to give it to you guys.
Perfect. I'm excited. Thanks. Have a good one.
You too.
That was J.M. Frey. She's the author of Time and Tide, as well as a whole bunch of other books. She's a voice actor, and she gives talks as well on world building and a whole bunch of other things. It's all the time we have for today's AMI Audio Digest. AMI Audiobook Review airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. We also make ourselves easy to find, though. You can find us on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can leave us feedback at audiobookraview@ami.ca. Always appreciate your feedback and your messages. We'll try to get to it on the show. You can also join us on Instagram at AMI Audio Book Review. I'm Jacob Shamansky. Happy listening.